going to be seeing, going to be having that meeting that you made reference to. It'll probably not be this evening, more likely tomorrow as a result of schedule problems. But Ambassador Armitage, Deputy Secretary Armitage, did meet with Pakistani officials today, and really to share views. We have not made a determination yet as to who is responsible for yesterday's attack, but we thought as we gather information and as we look at possible sources of the attack, it would be useful to point out to the Pakistani leadership at every level that we are looking for and expecting their fullest cooperation and their help and support as we conduct this investigation and as we generate more information, and see if they can be helpful in generating information, as well as how helpful they might be if we find a basis to act upon that information. So yes, we are doing what you described with the Pakistanis. Robert?
Just to clarify, when you say you're building a strong coalition to go after the perpetrators, does this mean that you are expecting or hoping that other countries will participate in some kind of military retaliation?
Under Article 5, if we go that far and it actually is executed, then there is an obligation on the part of our NATO allies to assist if we go in this direction. It doesn't mean that they necessarily will participate in the attack, but it makes it easier to obtain support in the way of overflight rights and things of that nature. So but I don't want to get into what we might or might not do and who might go with us and who might not go with us, because that's just too speculative at the moment.
Can I follow that? Having been through the Gulf War as you were, would you hope to build a kind of coalition that extends perhaps beyond NATO and includes perhaps Muslim nations from different parts of the world?
It should include Muslim nations. Muslim nations have just as much to fear from terrorism that strikes at innocent civilians. And I do have a number of calls, and I just haven't connected yet with other leaders in the world representing Muslim populations. As I was coming down, I was waiting to receive a call from Amma Musa, head of the Arab League, and I'll also be talking to my Egyptian colleagues and Jordanian colleagues before the evening is out. Yes, sir.
You have not yet mentioned the point that President Bush made last night, the idea of holding other countries responsible.
Yeah.
This seems to be a dramatic escalation in the U.S. view on how it responds to terrorism. Is that a correct interpretation of it? And as a follow-up, you talk about returning to normal, yet there have been all these mentions of acts of war, the idea that the country is in a war. How can we just return to normal when in a situation like this?
Well, on your first point, I mentioned in my earlier statements, and I will mention it again, that it's not just a matter of going after the perpetrators, but it's going after and dealing with the sources of support that they have, whether that source of support might come from a host country or other organizations that provide them. We have to make sure that we go after terrorism and get...
We wouldn't break away from the Secretary of State unless there was important news to report. ABC's Terry Moran is at the White House, and the President's spokesman, Terry, has just gone on the record to ABC News, believing what? That the plane which crashed into the Pentagon was intending to go somewhere else?
Well, Peter, it is a remarkable on-the-record statement from White House officials, White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer saying, quote, "We have reason to believe the plane that hit the Pentagon," and that was United Airlines 93 bound for San Francisco from Newark. "We have reason to believe that the plane that hit the Pentagon, its original target was the White House," according to Ari Fleischer, "and that Air Force One was also a target." Now, if you recall yesterday's flight that the President took from Florida to Louisiana to Nebraska and back, that Ann Compton was on, you recall those very dramatic pictures of the plane Air Force One being accompanied by fighter jets. Apparently they had credible information that Air Force One was also a target, but the information we're being given now that the investigation has developed, according to the White House itself was targeted.
Thank you very much, Terry. We'll come back to this in fuller detail, but I want to go back to the State Department briefing and maybe...
From America, and we cross to the Nine Network's Nigel Blunden, who's in Washington with our Prime Minister. He's just come out of a press conference held by John Howard in Washington. Nigel, what did the Prime Minister have to say?
Well, Mark, firstly, just on the immediate travel plans for John Howard, at 3 o'clock Eastern Time in the United States, that's 15 minutes from now. Under the original schedule on this day, John Howard was due to fly east to New York. However, he has told us that courtesy of an American Defense Force plane from the Andrews Air Force Base just outside Washington, he'll be flying southwest towards Honolulu and leaving America en route to Australia. The connection from Honolulu, it's not confirmed yet as to whether that will be a commercial airliner or whether a government, an Australian government, RAAF jet will be sent there to collect him. But John Howard will be leaving the United States, if it does leave on schedule, in around 15 minutes from now. It comes at the end of a much shortened day. Yesterday's schedule was cancelled in light of the events in New York and in Washington. Today the Prime Minister was originally due to address a joint sitting of the US Congress. He didn't do that. However, he did actually go to Congress and was certainly given a rousing welcome as he arrived.
The Chair wishes to acknowledge, however, the presence of the Prime Minister here today and extends on behalf of the House his appreciation for the solidarity of the Australian people and the presence of the Prime Minister today in this very difficult time. Thank you.
Nigel, what has Mr. Howard had to say about being caught up amid all this drama?
Well, the Prime Minister today, Mark, has drawn the analogy between what occurred yesterday in New York and in Washington, I guess really in the world, as drawn the analogy with what was occurring in the nuclear weapons arms race during the Cold War, and saying that it really is, in his mind, as bad as that. It's the end of the degree of innocence. We face a possibility that terrorism will be around like nuclear threats for a long time. It's the end, or the much shortened end, to John Howard's trip to the United States. Quite an emotional Prime Minister yesterday. That emotion's still there today, in that he's very touched by the events that he received at the US Congress this morning, and the Americans' appreciation of Mr. Howard's visit there to show our support, Australian support as a nation, for what this country and indeed the world is going through. With regards where he goes from here, he has said that Australia would consider showing all support behind the United States' actions in retaliation. There's been no firm commitment of military aid to any actions, and that's something which I guess will only be given, if it is given, once there is a determination by the United States of who is to blame and what action will be taken.
Well, Nigel, we just heard US Secretary of State Colin Powell saying that those responsible will pay, certainly upping the ante and preparing, it sounds like, for a massive military intervention. Has our Prime Minister been caught up or been talking with US officials in regard to that?
The best that he told us this afternoon, Mark, was that he has received several briefings, several high-level briefings from US defence officials on the events of the last 36 hours. He wouldn't go into the specifics of just who they came from. He has not spoken to the President, George W. Bush, since what occurred in New York. Of course, he met with him the day prior to these events. He has sent a letter to him expressing Australian condolences, and also likewise to the Vice President, his good friend Dick Cheney. But at this stage, the Australian government being kept in touch. We are a strong ally. While we haven't actually committed any military support at this stage, it will be a case that when push comes to shove, I'm sure the Americans will expect Australia to fall into line.
Nigel, if the Prime Minister does take off for Honolulu in around 10-15 minutes' time, I guess he'll be one of the first to be allowed back into the air after this attack from yesterday. What's the likely scenario? Get to Honolulu and our military pick up the travel arrangements from there?
Well, John Howard was non-committal on that, Mark. There's always the chance that one of the small RAF VIP jets could be sent to Honolulu to collect the Prime Minister and his party and complete the trip. However, at the same time, I think they will consider using a commercial airline. It's just, according to the Prime Minister, too early at this stage to say just how that second leg of the trip will be completed.
All right, Nigel, and what are your movements? What's been the reaction around Washington in the past 12 hours or so?
The reaction action in Washington is still a city that's trying to come back to life. It's not the ghost town that it was yesterday afternoon, but certainly not back to the full level of activity that you'd expect to see it on a working day in the centre of the city. The people in Washington themselves are coming to terms with what's occurred, the shock turning into mourning, and I guess it'll be a case of anger as they look for someone to blame and somebody for that retaliation to be aimed at.
Nigel, we'll leave it there. Thanks for talking with us. No doubt we'll hear a lot more from you throughout the next 2 or 3 days.
Thanks, Mark.